she came over here saying that he was hitting me and doing all of this, and he is hot-headed. He does have a mouth.
The first thing to understand about this encounter is how ordinary it appears at the surface. There are no flashing lights at the outset, no urgent radio traffic, no visible injuries demanding immediate intervention. What exists instead is a dispute being interpreted in real time by observers who are not neutral, who do not have full context, and who are operating under their own assumptions about risk, authority, and belonging. This distinction matters because law enforcement responses are often shaped less by what objectively occurs and more by how an event is framed before officers arrive. From the beginning, officers are responding not to a confirmed crime, but to a report filtered through at least two layers of interpretation. First, the perception of bystanders who witness a heated interaction from a distance. Second, the perception of a property manager who receives those reports and translates them into a narrative of disruption and threat. By the time deputies step onto the scene, they are not arriving to investigate an open question. They are arriving to resolve a presumed problem. This sets the tone for everything that follows. The individuals at the center of the incident are not hiding. They are not fleeing. They are not attempting to evade contact. They are present, visible, and engaged in conversation. This alone is significant. In police work, the absence of evasive behavior is a critical indicator that often weighs against criminal intent. Yet here, that factor is overshadowed almost immediately by the volume and intensity of competing claims. The male subject begins by explaining events in chronological order. He situates the disagreement in time and place. He describes his actions as protective rather than aggressive. Whether that interpretation is accurate is not the issue. The issue is that he is offering an explanation without coercion, without legal prompting, and without visible fear of scrutiny. This suggests a belief that facts will matter. At the same time, the female partner is interviewed separately. Her account mirrors key elements of his explanation while diverging in emotional emphasis. She acknowledges raised voices and tension. She does not deny physical contact entirely, but she characterizes it as nonviolent and situational. Most importantly, she consistently rejects the allegation that she was assaulted. In domestic violence investigations, officers are trained to be cautious when alleged victims deny abuse. That caution exists for good reason. Victims may minimize harm for many complex reasons. However, caution is not permission to disregard statements altogether. The law does not allow officers to simply substitute their own conclusions when direct participants provide consistent, non-accusatory accounts. This is where institutional psychology begins to take hold. Officers are now faced with a dilemma. Multiple third-party witnesses claim violence, while the alleged victim denies it. This creates cognitive dissonance. To resolve it, the system looks for cues that help decide which narrative is more credible. Those cues are often not evidentiary, they are behavioral. Tone becomes evidence. Demeanor becomes intent. Frustration becomes aggression. The male subject's manner of speaking is repeatedly referenced by others as problematic. He is described as mouthy, dismissive, and rude. These descriptors carry moral weight, but no legal meaning. Yet they begin to influence how his actions are interpreted retroactively. The same physical movement that might otherwise be seen as guiding or restraining is reclassified as forceful because of who performed it and how they spoke. This is not accidental. It is a well-documented phenomenon in enforcement decision-making. When officers encounter uncertainty, they gravitate toward the version of events that aligns with existing expectations of risk. A young man involved in a loud argument fits a familiar archetype. Once that archetype is activated, contradictory evidence must work harder to be believed. Meanwhile, the involvement of a property manager introduces a second axis of authority. This is not legal authority in the criminal sense, but it is social authority, ownership, residency, control over space. The manager's statements shift the focus from interpersonal conflict to territorial legitimacy. The issue becomes not just whether someone acted violently, but whether they had the right to be there at all. This shift is subtle, but powerful. By questioning residency, the manager reframes the male subject as an outsider. Outsiders are more easily scrutinized, more easily suspected, more easily removed. This is especially true in private communities where informal governance often blurs with formal law enforcement. Officers are receptive to this framing because it offers an alternative justification for intervention. If violence cannot be clearly established, disruption can be. If disruption is insufficient, trespass can be considered. Each layer expands the scope of authority. At this point, the investigation begins to slow down. Not because officers are being cautious, but because they are transitioning from fact-finding to decision-making. Questions are no longer exploratory, they are confirmatory. Each interaction is now about determining whether there is enough to act, not whether the action is necessary. The female partner's physical condition is examined more closely. Marks on her body are scrutinized. When one is identified, it briefly becomes a focal point. This moment is critical because it demonstrates how quickly suspicion can crystallize around a single visual cue. When the mark is explained as a birthmark, the explanation is accepted. But the investigative momentum does not reset. In policing, first impressions are difficult to undo. The absence of injury does not restore neutrality. Instead, the investigation simply shifts emphasis back to witness perception and behavioral interpretation. The logic becomes cumulative, even if no single piece of evidence is decisive. Together, they can justify action. This is where legal thresholds begin to blur. Reasonable suspicion requires articulable facts that criminal activity may be occurring. Probable cause requires facts that would lead a reasonable person to believe a crime has occurred. In this case, neither threshold is clearly satisfied through direct evidence. What exists instead is a narrative built from assumptions, discomfort, and social pressure to act. The officers are not malicious. They are methodical. They are calm. That calmness is important because it masks the gravity of what is happening. When authority is exercised without visible force, it often escapes scrutiny. But the consequences are no less severe. As the scene progresses, the male subject remains cooperative. He answers questions. He does not raise his voice toward officers. He does not attempt to leave. These behaviors traditionally mitigate enforcement outcomes. Here they are treated as neutral at best. This is because the decision-making framework has shifted. Officers are no longer asking, "Is there enough to arrest?" They're asking, "Is there any reason not to?" That is a profound inversion of legal logic. The presence of multiple witnesses, even when their accounts conflict, creates institutional pressure. Officers understand that failing to act in a reported domestic incident carries professional risk. Acting, even imperfectly, is often perceived as the safer option from a liability standpoint. This is how systems incentivize escalation. By the time officers confer privately, the outcome is already narrowing. There is no dramatic announcement, no visible turning point. The decision emerges quietly, almost bureaucratically. What began as a conversation is now a custodial situation. Yet nothing has changed on the ground. No new evidence has appeared. No threat has emerged. No resistance has occurred. The shift happens internally. This is the most dangerous form of authority, the kind that feels justified simply because it has been deliberated. As part one comes to a close, the viewer is left in a suspended moment. The scene appears calm. The participants appear cooperative. But the trajectory is unmistakable. The machinery of enforcement is now in motion, driven not by clarity but by institutional momentum. What happens next is not the result of a single act, but of every small decision that made reversal feel impossible. And that is where the true consequences begin. By the time the scene transitions into its next phase, the atmosphere has changed in ways that are not immediately visible, but are deeply consequential. The investigation is no longer expanding, it is narrowing. The range of acceptable outcomes has quietly collapsed into a single corridor, and everyone present is now moving inside it, whether they realize it or not. This phase is defined by institutional commitment. Once officers begin leaning toward enforcement, every subsequent interaction is filtered through that expectation. Questions are no longer designed to discover new information. They are designed to test whether the existing narrative can withstand scrutiny. This is not misconduct in the theatrical sense. It is procedural inertia, and it is one of the most powerful forces in modern policing. The officers continue speaking with witnesses, but the nature of those conversations subtly shifts. Inconsistencies are acknowledged, yet they are no longer treated as barriers. Instead, they are reframed as normal imperfections in human observation. What matters now is not whether the stories align perfectly, but whether they can be interpreted as pointing in the same general direction. Violence does not need to be proven beyond doubt. It only needs to be plausible enough to justify action. This is where domestic violence policy becomes decisive. Many departments operate under guidelines that strongly favor arrest when there is any indication of physical conflict, particularly when multiple witnesses are involved. These policies are rooted in historical failures to protect victims, but they also create environments where ambiguity is resolved through custody rather than caution. In this case, the alleged victim remains present, coherent, and consistent. She does not request medical attention. She does not express fear of the male subject. She does not attempt to separate herself from him. These factors would normally weigh heavily against an arrest, but policy reframes them as potentially unreliable indicators. The system assumes it knows better. At the same time, the male subject's earlier frustration continues to echo through the scene. It is referenced indirectly through tone and implication. He is characterized as someone whose behavior escalated the situation, not through violence, but through attitude. This characterization becomes a moral justification for enforcement, even though it has no legal basis. This is a critical psychological pivot. When officers perceive a subject as disrespectful or defiant, even passively, they are more likely to interpret ambiguity in the least charitable way. This is not conscious bias. It is threat perception shaped by occupational experience. Over time, law enforcement culture conditions officers to associate verbal resistance with future physical resistance, even when none has occurred. Here, that association fills evidentiary gaps. The involvement of the property manager continues to exert influence. Her presence reinforces the idea that the situation has already crossed a line of acceptability. She speaks not as a neutral observer, but as a guardian of order. Her concerns are framed in terms of disruption, liability, and community standards. These are not criminal concepts, but they resonate with officers tasked with restoring peace. Restoration becomes the goal, not resolution. This distinction matters because restoration prioritizes removing the perceived source of disturbance rather than determining responsibility. In many cases, that source is simply the person least aligned with local authority structures. Youth, outsider status, and perceived disrespect converge into a single profile. The male subject fits it. As officers continue their assessment, the possibility of alternative outcomes quietly disappears. De-escalation, separation without arrest, or referral to mediation are no longer discussed openly. The conversation has moved past options and into logistics. This is often how arrests happen, not with confrontation, but with paperwork. The female partner is informed of what is likely to occur, but she is not consulted in the decision. Her role shifts from participant to bystander. She is no longer the subject of protection. She is a witness to process. Her objections, while noted, do not alter the course. This reveals a central tension in the domestic violence enforcement: the balance between protecting individuals and respecting their autonomy. In this moment, autonomy loses. The officer's demeanor remains calm and professional. This calmness is important because it communicates inevitability. There is no argument to be had, no persuasion to attempt. The decision has already been absorbed into the system's sense of order. When the physical transition into custody occurs, it is swift. There is no countdown, no warning that detention is imminent. The male subject is instructed to comply with procedures that presume arrest. His body language reflects confusion more than fear. He does not resist, but he does not fully understand how the situation has reached this point. That confusion is not accidental. Procedural justice depends on transparency, on explaining not just what is happening, but why. Here, explanation is minimal. Authority is asserted through action rather than articulation. The message is implicit. The time for discussion has passed. From a legal standpoint, this is the most vulnerable moment in the encounter. The arrest must be justified by probable cause that existed before custody began. Yet the justification is never clearly articulated on scene. It exists in aggregate, dispersed across conversations, impressions, and assumptions. This makes accountability difficult. When probable cause is not tied to a specific act or observation, it becomes resistant to later scrutiny. Each element can be defended individually, even if none is sufficient alone. This is how weak cases survive initial review. The female partner attempts to maintain connection. She asks practical questions. She seeks reassurance. Her emotional state contrasts sharply with the severity of the outcome. There is no visible crisis, yet the consequences are severe. The male subject is processed with routine efficiency. Pockets are emptied. Personal items are secured. These actions are performed without hostility, but they carry immense symbolic weight. They mark the irreversible transition from citizen to detainee. Once this transition occurs, the system's priorities change again. The focus shifts from whether the arrest was necessary to how it will be completed. Transport logistics, holding procedures, and charge classification take precedence. The original context, the argument, the misunderstanding, the conflicting perceptions fades into the background. What remains is a charge label. Domestic violence charges are particularly heavy. They trigger mandatory detention policies, delayed bond hearings, and automatic restrictions. These consequences apply regardless of injury severity or victim cooperation. The label itself carries punishment. This is where institutional design reveals its blunt edges. The officers do not celebrate the arrest. They do not express satisfaction. They behave as though they are completing an unpleasant but required task. This demeanor reinforces the idea that the outcome was unavoidable, a product of rules rather than choice. But rules are applied by people. Every step leading here involved discretion. How seriously to treat witness accounts, how much weight to give denial, how to interpret demeanor, how to frame authority. Each choice narrowed the path until only one option remained. As Part 2 draws to a close, the viewer is left with a stark imbalance. One person is about to lose freedom, employment opportunities, and legal standing. Another is free to leave, still insisting no crime occurred. The system has chosen which narrative will carry legal force, not because it was proven, but because it was operationally convenient. By the time the final phase begins, the encounter has moved beyond investigation, beyond discretion, and beyond dialogue. What remains is procedure. Procedure is often mistaken for neutrality, but in reality, it is the stage at which earlier assumptions harden into permanent record. Once custody is initiated, the system no longer asks whether the arrest was justified. It assumes that it was. Every subsequent action is designed to support that assumption. The male subject is now treated as a detainee, not because new information has emerged, but because the institutional momentum has crossed a threshold that rarely allows reversal. This is one of the least understood aspects of modern policing, the difficulty of stopping once enforcement begins. Even officers who privately question the strength of a case are constrained by policy, peer expectation, and the fear of appearing inconsistent. In this moment, authority no longer needs to persuade. It only needs to move forward. The female partner is informed of what will happen next in administrative terms. The language used is calm, procedural, and detached. Jail location, bond timing, court appearance. These details are delivered as facts, not decisions. This framing subtly removes agency from everyone involved. No one is choosing this outcome anymore. It is simply unfolding. This is how responsibility becomes diffuse. The woman's reaction is restrained. She does not celebrate. She does not express relief. She does not indicate fear of future harm. Her demeanor contradicts the severity of the charge, but that contradiction no longer matters. Emotional alignment is not a requirement for prosecution. What matters now is classification. Domestic violence charges operate differently from most other criminal allegations. They are designed to err on the side of intervention, prioritizing potential safety over evidentiary certainty. In theory, this protects vulnerable individuals. In practice, it can also override context, nuance, and proportionality. Here, the charge triggers mandatory detention. There is no immediate bond, no option for citation and release. no consideration of the alleged victim's wishes. The system has decided that separation through incarceration is the safest outcome, regardless of whether danger has been demonstrated. This is not an accusation of bad faith. It is an illustration of structural rigidity. As the male subject is transported, his physical absence resolves the immediate problem for the community. The argument is over. The disturbance is gone. The neighborhood returns to quiet. From an enforcement perspective, this is success. Peace has been restored. But peace achieved through removal is not the same as justice achieved through understanding. The paperwork that follows, or only, will tell a simplified story. It will record witness statements, officer observations, and charge codes. It will not capture hesitation, doubt, or contradiction. It will not reflect the alleged victim's repeated denials in the same weight as third-party perceptions. It will not convey how close this case was to being handled differently. Official records rarely show the road not taken. In the days that follow, the consequences expand outward. The arrest may appear in background checks, employment opportunities may be affected, legal defense costs will accumulate, court appearances will consume time and resources. Even if charges are later reduced or dismissed, the arrest itself remains a fact. This is the lasting power of authority. It does not need to be permanent to be impactful. For the female partner, the aftermath is equally complex. She may be called upon to testify in a case she does not believe in. She may face pressure from prosecutors to cooperate. She may feel guilt for an outcome she repeatedly tried to prevent. The system that claimed to act on her behalf now operates independently of her perspective. This can erode trust, not just in law enforcement, but in the idea of protection itself. The property manager and witnesses return to their routines. Their role in the escalation ends at the moment of arrest. They are unlikely to face scrutiny for misinterpretation or exaggeration. Their statements were enough to trigger action, but not enough to require accountability. This asymmetry is built into the process. Those who report are protected. Those who are reported on bear the risk. From a broader institutional lens, this case illustrates how authority is often exercised not at moments of obvious danger, but at moments of ambiguity. Ambiguity invites discretion. Discretion invites bias. Bias invites outcomes that feel justified internally, even when they're difficult to defend externally. The body camera captures this entire arc, but it does not resolve it. Viewers may search for a single moment where everything went wrong, a raised voice, a gesture, a decision. But the truth is more unsettling. Nothing went wrong all at once. Each step was reasonable in isolation. Each decision was defensible on its own terms. It is only when viewed in sequence that the pattern emerges. A steady narrowing of options, a gradual sidelining of the people most directly involved, and an increasing reliance on authority figures who were never at risk themselves. This is how misuse of authority often appears, not as abuse, but as overconfidence. Overconfidence in perception, overconfidence in policy, overconfidence in the belief that acting is always safer than not acting. The final unresolved question is not whether a crime occurred. That will be argued in court, filtered through motions and hearings and legal standards that operate long after the cameras stop recording. The deeper question is whether the process itself served its intended purpose. Did it protect someone in danger? Did it accurately identify wrongdoing? Did it apply the law proportionally and fairly? Or did it simply prioritize order over understanding, certainty over truth, and authority over accountability. The footage ends with quiet. But the silence that follows is not closure. It is the space where consequences continue to unfold, largely unseen, shaped by decisions that felt routine in the moment. And that is where the real weight of this encounter resides. Not in what was said, but in what could no longer be undone once authority decided it was finished listening.